All right? Now, what's amazing about Marx is that today we say he's wrong, right? Communism happened in the Soviet Union, it happened in China, but it didn't happen in Europe and in the United States, where Marx said it would happen first because Germany was more industrialized than Russia or China. Okay? Does that make sense? That's what we say. But if you think about it deeply, okay, Marx was right. After World War II, every society, every industrial society, to some extent, adopted the ideals of communism. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, we call this socialism and not communism, but basically it adhered to the thinking of Marx, which is to make the worker the heart and center of your society. And why did they do that after World War II? Exactly, okay? Because workers create value. Okay? Money doesn't create any value. Money just creates more money. It's speculative. But the workers create value. They're productive. And therefore, you have to treat your workers properly. So in America and in Europe, workers became the heart and center of your society. And the workers, through unions, could demand political reforms. And so all of society was geared towards making the lives of the middle class, the working class, better, okay? That's why you had excellent health care, great public schools, cheap universities. Okay? So the 50s and 60s and 70s was basically the peak of society for the working class. But in the 80s, we start to change this. Why? Why would we want to change the system? It's a great system, right? Marx is right. Having the worker as the heart and center of your society, as the central organizing unit of your society, makes a lot more sense than having money as the heart and center, okay? But starting in the 80s, we start to go back to money. Why? Excuse me?
Like they have the production necessary for society, so they want more. Like,
who wants more? Yes, exactly. Okay. So what happened in the 80s is something called the revolt of the elite. Okay? In other words, the problem with having a society based on the worker is it becomes too egalitarian, too equal, right? But if you're like the elite, you don't want equality, you want difference. You want to have power and money in your hands. Does that make sense? So the revolt of the elite happened in the 80s, and this is what we call in the United States the Reagan Revolution, okay? The Reagan Revolution. The beginning of neoliberalism, free market capitalism. And in Britain, it was called Thatcherism, okay? Margaret Thatcher, the Thatcher Revolution. And so now you need to transition away from the worker to something else, okay? Another ideology that allows the elite to amass power, okay? So just to show you how radical this revolution was. In the 1970s, okay, 1970s, if you were a CEO, the head of a company, okay, you were making on average $1 million a year. That's pretty good, right? That's really good money. And that $1 million was more than 20 times the worker. Okay? And that's pretty reasonable. Today, the average CEO in the United States makes $20 million a year. And that is 200 to 300 times more than the average worker in the company. Okay, does that make sense? So in the 80s, inequality started to explode, right? And so they were transitioning from the worker to a new organizing unit called the consumer. Okay? So they needed to destroy the working class, the middle class. And the way they did it was by introducing a new concept called the consumer, okay? So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the government promised you a good job. If you were a member of a society, if you were a citizen, I promise you a good job that you would have for the rest of your life, okay? So in the 80s, the government said, I promise you that you have low prices and a wide selection of goods. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so this sounds like a subtle shift, going from the worker to the consumer, okay? But what this meant was a revolution in society, a revolution in politics. So remember that, an example of the worker has to have political consciousness in order to protect his or her rights, in order to organize and unify and push for favorable political reforms, okay? That's what the worker must do, okay? But now let's think about the mentality of the consumer. And to do this, let's do another thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Everyone in the school, about 500 people, I decide to give everyone $1 million US, okay? So everyone in the school has exactly $1 million US to spend. What happens now? Think about this. What happens now? Use your imagination. What happens? What's the first thing you do?
Consumerism is the perfection of slavery. I found out this professor like 3 months ago, and I like the way he predicted the fight between Iran and the United States and all of these geopolitical factors was gonna happen. And that's when I loved his work and fell in love with his explanation towards all these issues that geopolitically is affecting the world. Today, people in the world are getting to understand that consumerism is one big part of the problem. And that's why everyone is getting caught, because this is something that it happens to us even when we don't know. The statement, consumerism is the perfection of slavery, is provocative. But when we dig into American history, it becomes clearer why many thinkers believe it holds the truth. Let me take you back in slavery era. Control over people's life was totally visible and brutally enforced. Enslaved people were compelled to work under the threat of violence, and their labor was the property of someone else. Now, their value, their life was a property of someone else. In consumerism, the control is far more subtle. Instead of chains and overseers, there are credit scores, advertising campaigns, and economic structures that compel people to work endlessly, not just for survival, but to purchase goods and maintain lifestyle shaped by corporate and cultural messaging. This creates a system where individuals may believe that they are exercising freedom through choice. But in reality, many are locked into patterns of debt and dependency, and that benefit powerful economic actors in much the same way slavery enriched plantation owners. So you need to get to understand how this is affecting people. People buy things to verify their happiness. People buy things to get whatever they want to buy. But people are not looking the dark side of this culture, the consumerism culture, and who pushed the consumerism culture. America marks one of the continent with the biggest consumerism culture. You need to understand that. So I want us to read this video. It is really, really important for us to get to learn all these issues. And I think that's the most important thing, because by learning, we get to learn from the mistakes that we made and how the societies that we live are pushing all these factors. I'll call them factors. They're pushing these factors to us, which makes us act in a given way. And at the end of it all, it is us who are suffering. So let's watch the video. I'll be back, and then we'll be having a critical analysis in regards to all these issues that we are going to be talking about. And I hope you find these videos so much informative. So I don't want to say much, but let's just get into it. I'll be back with my thoughts at the end of it all.
What's the first thing you do? I've given you $1 million. What do you do with it? Well, the first thing you do is buy something, right? What do you want to buy? $1 million is a lot of money. What do you want to buy, Nap? You buy a house, right? That's great. That's a great purchase. Then what do you do? Then what do you do? Okay, first thing is Nap buys a house. Then what does he do? Excuse me? Buy furniture. Then what does he do? There's something that he must do that's very important. What does he buy the house? What does he want to do? He wants to take pictures and post on social media, right? So everyone sees it on social media. Then you see this. Nap has this huge house in Beijing with lots of fancy furniture. What do you do now? You also want to buy a house. But what kind of house? A bigger house, right? And then what do you do? You also post pictures, okay? Then how do other people feel? You think this is funny, okay? But this happens all the time. So very quickly, what happens in the school? And you all spend your money, and you all go into debt, right? Because you're in competition with each other to buy the biggest thing. And $1 million is a lot of money, but it's not enough to buy everything, right? So you go into debt. You borrow more money to buy more things. And then what happens? And then what happens? How do you guys feel about each other? Do you guys have lunch together? Do you guys have dinner together? Do you guys like to share homework together? You guys hate each other, right? At the end of the day, what will happen is you all go into debt and you all hate each other, right? So that's consumerism. This is what consumerism is. Consumerism creates a competition in society for prestige, okay? To see who can post the nicest social media pictures. This leads to the individualization or the optimization of you, okay? In other words, you are now unable to act together. You don't want to organize. You don't want to act in solidarity, okay? And ultimately, this means that you develop economic logic, okay? And what is economic logic? It's to see the world only through the lens of capital. Okay, does it make sense? So when you see someone and you're like, okay, well, do I want to date this person? You don't ask, oh, is this person a nice person? You ask yourself, how much money does this person have? Okay, do you understand? You use economic logic in order to understand the world and to reason and analyze the world, okay? Now, let me ask you this question. Today, is this how China works? Is this how the world works? The answer is yes, okay? Are you like this? Yes, you are like this, okay? You've been brainwashed into thinking that this is the only way to behave and to think. You're in school. Why are you in school? So you can get a good job. Why? To make money. And so you can buy things, okay? You understand? That's how you all think. But there are different ways to think about school, right? You're like, I'm in school to learn, to open my mind, to have an imagination, to think critically about the world, right? And that was the way we thought about school when the workers were dominant. But now that consumers are dominant, all we think about is, how do I get a good job? How do I buy a bigger house? Because I want to post it on social media. Okay? So, if you think about this, what this really is the perfection of slavery. Okay? Does it make sense? What does this phrase mean? The perfection of slavery. Yeah, you become a slave of the money, but what? Why is this perfect? Yes, okay? You understand? If you're a slave, you rebel, right? But if you don't know you're a slave, and you like this, you choose this, then you will never rebel, okay? So the consumerism is the perfection of slavery, okay? And that's why Francis Fukuyama thinks that consumerism is the end of history, because it is a system that achieves what the elites want, and the masses are unwilling and unable to protest and rebel. Okay, does that make sense? It's a perfect system.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great. From wherever you're watching me from, I'm your host and presenter Agent Stories. We are here to have a good time. We are here to talk about all these issues because in one way or another, it is affecting each and one of us. So it is valid that we get to discuss about these issues because they are affecting us on a daily basis. The roots of this parallel can be traced to how slavery built the economic foundation of modern America. Remember, in the 18th century and the 19th century, the cotton economy in South generated enormous wealth, not just plantation owners, but also northern banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms. Enslaved people themselves were treated as collateral for loans, much like houses or cars today. The financial innovation developed the profit from human being laid the groundwork of the modern credit system. The key difference is that today, instead of legally being owned, people are owned, right, through their debts and financial obligation. Their time and labor are promised to lenders and employers for years, sometimes decades, creating a form of bondage that is not called slavery, but it limits personal freedom. Let's get back to history and look at the history of consumerism and how it became to be. After the Civil War, emancipation did not lead to a true economic independence for most of freed black people. Remember that sharecropping and debt peonage kept them tied to the land and to white landowners through endless cycles of borrowing and repayment. They were technically free but unable to break the economic system that exploited their labor. In modern twists, consumer debt in America operates similarly, whether through mortgages, student loans, medical bills, or credit cards. People find themselves in a cycle where they work primarily to service debts. This particularly visible in marginalized communities where predatory lending and lack of access to generational wealth mean people are more likely to be blocked into long-term financial obligations. Also remember that the rise of mass consumerism in the early 20th century marked a new stage in the system of control. Before industrialization and modern advertising, most Americans lived with a culture of thrift, making do with what they had and saving for what they needed. But as manufacturing and distribution system advanced, companies needed to create constant demand for their products. Advertising was no longer about informing consumers of a byproduct's existence. It became about creating psychological needs. By promoting an endless stream of must-have items tied to identity, success, and social acceptance, corporations cultivated a public eager to buy often on credit, the consumer became less a free agent and more captive participant in system designed to keep them spending. Also, credit was a masterstroke in making this form of economic control and more effective. Installment plans and revolving credit meant that people could acquire goods immediately while committing future labor to pay for them. This mirrors slavery time theft though without the physical violence, by binding future labor to present consumption. In modern era, this has escalated to debt culture, where people take on massive loans for homes, cares, and education, ensuring that they remain tied to the labor market for decades. The system brilliance lies in making this bondage feel voluntary and even desirable because it is framed as freedom to buy and own. Also, advertising's role cannot be overstated. It taps into insecurities, it taps into desires and social pressures, convincing people that their worth is measured by what they own rather than who they are. And in doing so, it ensures that even those who might otherwise be content are pushed towards constant consumption. This psychological manipulation can be seen as the perfection of slavery because it eliminates the need for physical coercion. People willingly surrender their time, money, and independence to keep up with ever-shifting cultural definition of status and success. Also, you need to get to learn that in many ways, home ownership in America is the perfect example of consumerism as a form of control. Federal policies in the mid 20th century encouraged Americans to buy homes as a sign of stability and success, but the mortgage that came with them ensured decades of debt payment. For many, especially in suburban areas, this debt discouraged political risk-taking or radical change because homeowners feared anything that could destabilize property values. It's a subtle but powerful form of social control, ensuring that people prioritize economic security tied to debt over broader social and political transformation. The comparison the comparison to slavery becomes even sharper when we look at labor conditions under slavery. Labor was coerced for the benefit of the master. Under modern consumerism capitalism, many people work long hours at job they dislike primarily to maintain lifestyle shaped by consumers' expectation and debt obligations. The difference is that the master, quote unquote, is now a diffuse system. Banks, corporations, landlords, and advertisers that doesn't need to own the worker outright to extract their labor. Instead, it owns their obligation and therefore their time. The system also reduces inequality in a way that echoes slavery, racial, and class hierarchies. Marginalized groups are often targeted by predatory lending practices, denied fair wages, or excluded from wealth-building opportunities, ensuring they remain in a perpetual state of economic precarity. This is not accidental. It is a continuation of policies and structures that have, for centuries, sought to keep certain groups in subordinate positions. And in this light, consumerism is not just the perfection of slavery in a general sense, but also a refinement of racialized economic control. Global supply chains that feed American consumerism also reveal how the logic of slavery persists beyond U.S. borders. Many of the chips consumed in America are produced in sweatshops, on plantations, or in mines under exploitative conditions that are barely distinguishable from forced labor. This means that Even as Americans see themselves as free consumers, their purchasing habits often sustain system of exploitation elsewhere. In a way, consumerism perpetuates slavery's global legacy, outsourcing the most visible forms of exploitation to the developing world. The genius and the danger of consumerism as control system is that it doesn't look like oppression. Yes, but people believe they are free because they choose what to buy, where to live, and how to spend. But the boundaries of those choices are defined by debt, economic necessity, and manufactured desires. This is why some describe it as perfected slavery. It achieves the same end, control over people's labor and lives, without needing overt violence or visible chains. It is more efficient, more adaptable, and even more invisible than the system evolved from it. And ultimately, the statement consumerism is the perfection of slavery is less about equating the brutality of chattel slavery with modern economic life and more about recognizing the continuity in methods of control. America moved from owning people to owning the obligations, from forced labor through whips to compelling it through the promise of goods and the threat of financial ruin. Understanding this connection forces us to to see consumerism not as a mere personal choice, but as a powerful economic system rooted in the same logic that once justified slavery, extracting the maximum labor and value from people while keeping them dependent on the system that exploits them. Really, I want to know what you think about this video. It was much educative than I thought, but I hope we all get to learn from this. But until then, let me see you on my next video. I'm your host and presenter, Chinok Stories. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.